All right, so I was not going to start with this, but first I want to say thank you for the invitation. I love TED events, partly because I think it's really rare that we have an opportunity to sit down together and really pause and reflect. There's a story that I really love about two woodcutters up in Nova Scotia, and there was a competition to determine who was the best woodcutter. And so there was a day-long competition where they brought piles of wood and they put a big tarp up, and each woodcutter was on different sides of the tarp. And at the starting point, the first woodcutter kind of went and he started chopping, and he heard the sounds next in the kind of area next door of the second woodcutter. And after about 2 hours, the second woodcutter stopped. And the first woodcutter said, look at him, he's tired already, I knew I was the best, and he kept on going. And then the second woodcutter started up again, and about 3 hours later, the second woodcutter stopped again. And the first woodcutter was just rolling his eyes, like, God, I'm just gonna beat the pants off him. And at the end of the day, they sort of brought down the tarp, they counted up the cords of wood that each woodcutter had cut, and it turned out the second woodcutter had cut more. And the first woodcutter said to him, I don't understand. 3 times during the day, you stopped. And how is it that you still managed to chop more wood than I did? And the second woodcutter said, you know, when you heard the pause, I wasn't resting, I was sharpening my axe. And I think these sorts of opportunities are times when we get together and we have a chance to really think about ideas and sharpen our axes and hopefully walk away doing the work that we do better. So I want to start by saying that I'm sitting in between 2 gentlemen who I knew were going to talk about the work that they're doing, which itself is incredibly innovative, and I kind of follow Mike around. So Mike conceived a 191, and I worked with his team as they were doing it, and then I spent the last 9 months of my life working with the state council that was developing out the recommendations for 191. And the teacher tryout program, which Mike just described, is my second piece of work at Legacy, and so I'm helping to sort of conceive of the work plan for this. And so I thought for sure that there probably wasn't very much I was going to say about my work at Legacy that was going to do a better job than what Mike could do. And I know that Furman is going to talk about charters and sort of the charter space. And so what I wanted to do today was to really do what TED encourages us to do, which is not give our usual shtick, but to dream a great dream and to tell a story and to really share something with you that I don't think I've shared, at least here in Colorado. And so I think there'll be a chance to talk about Legacy and the work that we do, but I wanted to take some time to really think about what it means to radically collaborate and what it means to improve education, and specifically to focus on 2 words, education and radical. But the disclaimer I will give is that I worked with Ken a while ago. So I went through a traditional teacher certification program. I didn't go through TFA, it was still new when I went into teaching. So I went through a traditional teacher certification program, taught, and then after a few years, I really felt like I needed to step back out into the policy world, and Ken and I ended up working together at a foundation in New Jersey where I worked on learning in the arts and the issues of creativity. And so I was laughing because he took the middle third of my talk. And so I will reference his talk and then sort of expand a bit on the themes, but I grew a lot working with him, and his ideas have fundamentally driven a lot of the work that I've done. So I'm a philosopher by training. I went to college and I studied philosophy, and my parents were horrified because there are just not that many gainful employment opportunities for people who study philosophy, and they're still really happy that I have a job. But the reason that I stuck with philosophy is that there was something about the discipline that really appealed to me. For those of you who know the history of philosophy or have read much in it, you'll know that if you go back far enough, there was no such thing as disciplines. There wasn't biology, there wasn't science, there wasn't psychology or even theology. There were philosophers, and philosophers were the people who sat around and asked questions about the world. And when they found questions for which they could form some sort of a hypothesis that could be tested and sort of move on, eventually what happened is disciplines broke out. So they would ask questions about the world and the nature of the world, and all of a sudden you had physics kind of developing out of ontology, or they asked questions about the nature of human beings, and theology kind of as a discipline began to emerge. And so what I think philosophers do and do well is ask questions. And I think questions are at the heart of progressing and advancing. And if we ask the right questions, I think we have a much better idea of where it is that we're trying to go and how we can get there. And so in that spirit, I just want to take some time to ask questions today. And the first one I want to ask is, what is education? And what is education supposed to be? What's it supposed to achieve? And as Ken stated far more eloquently than I could, our current education system, both public, private, charter, is very much grounded on this industrial model of education. Our current public education system, as we conceive of it, was developed in the 1800s, right around the time of the scientific enlightenment and the kind of change in industry. And part of the purpose was to help working class children become citizens and workers. But you needed to know enough reading to be able to read the Bible. You needed to know enough about sort of math and what you needed to do to be a farmer or to be a worker, and enough to sort of vote for a leadership class, which was then going to run the world. And so public education was developed in that light. And we talked about local boards of education because towns were 20 miles apart, and in those days it took you 5 hours to get to the town next door. And so it made perfect sense that schools were structured within small communities, and that local board or that local community would drive the education of their children. And we had school days where there was a one-room schoolhouse, and teachers had to figure out how to teach children from the age of 5 until 12 or 13, all in one schoolhouse. And so it made sense that you segmented them into grades, and you had a curriculum, and the teacher kind of delivered it and tested the students so they know how to move forward. And we had school years that kind of started at a certain time of day, ended at a certain time of day, so kids could go home and do their chores. And they didn't have school in the summer because they were needed for farming and harvesting. And so our current system, so many of the structures that we have in place are based on historical circumstance and things that were done at a certain time in a certain context. And the question is whether those things really are important for us to keep today, or whether there are fundamentally things about our system that we ought to be questioning. But if you look at our model of education, it still is something that takes place within 4 walls of a classroom. It is still very much driven by teachers, even in charter schools, and even though we're sort of reconceiving of what it is that teachers do and how they do it, it is still very much teacher-driven. And it is about imparting certain knowledge to students and then testing them at the end of it. And while I take Mike's point that we can get better assessments, the foundations of what we're doing are still really similar. And so the question I want to ask is, what is the purpose of education today? And I can't think about that question without thinking about my own experience as a teacher and now as a parent. I have a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old. And the focus of my thinking is really captured well by one student that I had. And those of you who have taught will know that there are often sort of 1 or 2 students who are at once the most difficult students, and they make your life havoc on certain days, and you kind of go home and you obsess about them and you worry about them, but because you spend so much time thinking about them and worrying about them and obsessing them, they sort of wriggle their way into your heart. And Joel was that student for me in my first year. And he came from a really difficult family background, father in prison, mother there, a number of half-siblings, just kind of a really poor environment in Newark. And he spent a large part of his time really thwarting the kind of calm, structured classroom environment that I was trying to create as a first-year teacher, which is hard enough without Joel. And so Joel was this sort of student who, we're using paper mache to do a project, and Joel decides he's going to try and style his hair with it, because if it makes the paper kind of, straight and hard, then maybe he can do it with his hair, and he really wanted spiky hair. Or we're learning about physics, and we're learning about displacement of water, and 2 big balls didn't, displace the tub, and so, gosh, let's go put in somebody's textbook and somebody's this and that, because I want to know. I want to know what it does take to make the water rise, and I want to know when it's going to spill over. And my favorite moment with him came one afternoon. We just had a really rough day, and so in the afternoon I kind of paused, and I was trying to do this motivational exercise with the kids to really help them think about, you got to keep on striving for something more. And so I, had them gather around, and I said, okay, I'm going to give a $1 bill, because bribery is definitely in the teacher toolkit, particularly in the first year. So I'll give a $1 bill to the student who can raise their hand the highest. And so, all the kids are there, and they're waving their hands around. And then I said, okay, now I want you to raise them even higher. And so, they kind of stand on tiptoes, and they're reaching up and standing on each other's kind of desks and chairs. And then I said, okay, now I want you to raise them even higher. And Joel's sitting there, and Joel is probably one of the shortest kids in the class by that point, and he must know there's no way he's going to get that $1 bill. And so he kind of bolts out of the classroom, and I'm like, oh, great. So I'm running, and I kind of catch him, 10 feet down the hall. Joel, where are you going? It's okay. I know you tried your hardest, and that's great. Joel looks at me. He's like, well, if I be raising my hand the highest, I'm getting that dollar bill, right? And I said, yeah, you would. Whoever raised it gets the dollar bill. He said, well, then I'm going up to the roof. And I didn't know what to do at that moment. Part of me is saying, he can't do that. He needs to know the parameters of this exercise. Just leave the classroom, go up to the roof. And then the other part of me, and it's the part that I think has gotten stronger over the years as I've kind of thought about him and thought about kids and been a parent, and that it's been interesting to watch that, kind of thinks, well, why not? He went beyond my kind of limited idea of what he should do with that exercise. He demonstrated a level of kind of thinking and creativity which pushed beyond my own limitations as the teacher and the adult in the classroom. And isn't that what I want? Isn't that what I want for him to do and to be and to aspire to? And if the answer to that question is yes, right, if we wanted Joel, and if we want our kids to aspire to engage in the world in a way that goes beyond what we as adults can conceive of, and I think that's even more true in today's environment. Nobody could have told you 15 years ago that we were going to be living in a world where we could broadcast these sorts of things across the web and tweet and have iPhones and all sorts of things. If what we want is to prepare our children to be able to engage in a world that we can't even conceive of, then it seems to me that we need to take really seriously the possibility that we as adults may stand in the way of creating a system that works for kids and what they need to be able to do. Because we as adults and as educators have really gone through a process that has shaped our thinking in line with what the world is and what the limitations are and what the norms are. And that's not something that kids have done. They haven't been enculturated. They haven't been, dare I say it, indoctrinated. And so they have a lot more fluidity and flexibility in their thinking than I think we can even conceive of, as I think kind of Ken pointed out. And the reality is that we sort of pay lip service to the idea that creativity and innovation is going to propel the world forward, and yet we continue to operate within a system that was built to do something else, or to kind of, as Ken said, sort of really have parameters of what it means to be a good student, which are quite limited. And we take individuals. We hear stories. Richard Branson, who was considered a horrible student, he dropped out at age, in 8th grade, 9th grade. He's gone on to form Virgin Atlantic Airlines. He's one of the most successful entrepreneurs in the world. I keep hearing stories these days about kids who are socially connected, and they're using media to go and raise money for victims and other children's in kind of war-torn or kind of natural disaster-torn areas, and they do this on their own. And we tend to think of these individuals as exceptional. They're great, and they sort of came out and they were creative, and they didn't need what our education system would have provided them. They managed to be creative all on their own. But I wonder what would happen if we flipped the question, which is actually they're exceptional because they went through the system and still managed to be creative, or they went through the system and recognized that the system wasn't doing what they needed it to do for them, and sort of had the courage to leave. So if the reason that we went into education is to do what's best for kids, I think we have to ask ourselves if what we are doing is what kids need, or whether it's what we're doing because it's comfortable for us, and it's what we know, and it's what we kind of think we want our world to look like. Maybe we need to stop viewing students as the recipients of products that we design and deliver, and consider the possibility that they are creative, and that's exactly why we as teachers and educators and parents are often threatened by the sort of ways in which they push us and their nonconformity to the ideals that we've set up for them as students. So if we stop making assumptions about what good students look like, then we might actually be more creative about thinking about what good education looked like and what effective teaching looked like. So maybe it's not about seat time in class. Maybe it's not about covering a ridiculously amount of content knowledge in 12 years of schooling, when students are always going to have unlimited access to data at any moment through the internet and whatever other means they need. And maybe it's not all about teacher-directed models of instruction, which is what we really tend to be focusing on and what the current discourse around teacher effectiveness sort of continues to promote. So if we think that we might not be able to conceive of what education ought to be, then the answer, I think, is that we need to go outside of ourselves as educators and adults and really push ourselves to collaborate and to dialogue and discourse with people who haven't been grounded in our own kind of sense of what education is supposed to be. And I was talking yesterday with somebody who told me about the history of this building when it was being built. And when it was being built, apparently there was a big kind of discussion among the faculty members about what it should look like. And there were a lot of people who sort of thought, well, I kind of want something that feels the same but nicer. You know, maybe nicer carpets, a few more windows, all in one building, so I don't have to. And it turned out that the faculty and administrators weren't the people who were able to envision this sort of a space. It was the architect, right? It was somebody who wasn't part of the world and didn't have a conceived notion of what a building should look like, and instead was able to say, well, you say this is what you want it to be, so let me help you build something that is of a different structure. And I think it's a useful analogy for us moving forward. What if we learned from other sectors about how they fund the work that they do? Would we think about funding education differently, moving from a property tax-based system where I care about my schools because my tax dollars go to these schools and not others, to a more state-based or a more regional model where I as a parent can send my kids to any school in a region or any school in a state, and so I have a vested interest in the quality of all schools and not just the one that sits in my neighborhood or my district. What if we challenge the assumption that every local district needs to have complete autonomy around the curriculum and instructional decisions? Because is it really true that kids 15 miles apart are so different that they need different curriculum or different assessments or different kind of teacher metrics? What if we seriously challenge the notion that kids should be within four walls of a classroom? Would we be creative about how we use technology, about what it looks like to do internships and learn kind of in a vocational or project-based setting? If we learned from economists about upfront investments, would we spend some of our money on universal early childhood instead of building prisons? If we took what developmental neuroscientists know now about how children learn, hugely enriched body of knowledge in the last 20 years. Would we think about our curriculum differently? Would we stop saying, this is what we want kids to do in 12 years and chop it up in equal bits, understanding that kids go through spurts where they're going to be more able to deal with certain things and that different kids develop differently. And so proficiency at third grade might look different for different kids. So there are an incredibly large number of ways, I think, that we would ask. If we ask the right questions, we might think really differently about the assumptions that we have. And Legacy is really dedicated to that sort of work, to thinking about, even though they paid me to spend the last 9 months talking about effective teachers, one of the questions we're asking is, what if an effective teacher is not an effective teacher is an effective teacher? What if teachers may actually be really good at working with different populations of kids? Some teachers thrive at project-based kind of education. What if there are kids who are really well suited to that teacher, as opposed to every teacher being able to teach every single student with every single type of learning need? How do you use data to help us get a sense of what it means to be an effective educator in light of the children that we're trying to work with? So I guess I just want to leave you with the idea that as educators, I think it's really important for us to think outside of our discipline, to think outside of our boxes, and to collaborate. And I think that one of the opportunities we have in Colorado, because we as a community are kind of small enough and close enough, is to challenge each other to do that and to work really collaboratively to have a collective impact approach where we step outside of our boxes. I'm a university, this is what I want to do. I'm a not-for-profit, this is what I want to do. I'm a philanthropist, this is what I want to fund. Think about the end goal and the vision, and then have everybody come together around that common vision, taking a piece of ownership of the whole.